Hello and welcome to yet another tutorial by Davies Media Design. My name is Michael Davies, and in today's tutorial I'll be showing you an easy 10-step process for editing your photos in GIMP. But of course, before I get into that, I want to direct you guys over to my website at daviesmediadesign.com. As always, we have tons of GIMP video and text tutorials on here, so definitely check that out. You can also enroll in my best-selling GIMP 2.10 photo editing course from beginner to pro photo retoucher on Udemy. And you can support our channel and help us grow by becoming a patron on Patreon, and I'll include a link to this as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. So this tutorial is a basics on photo editing using GIMP, so whether you are a new photographer or you're new to using this free and awesome program GIMP, maybe you just want to learn an easy process for editing your photos start to finish every time. So a quick disclaimer, every photo is different, so even though you can use this process each time you edit a photo, the settings are going to be a little bit different every time, especially depending on the lighting and the time of day you took the photo, the type of camera you use, the type of lens you used. So there's many different variables when it comes to taking photos. Keep that in mind when you are using each of these tools. Don't just save the settings and use the same settings every time. It could ruin certain photos, whereas other photos might look great. So just something to keep in mind here at the beginning of this tutorial. But let's go ahead and dive in here. So this was the final photo that I edited for this tutorial here, but I'm going to come over here to my file manager and find the file that I want to open here in GIMP. I just typed here in my search bar. And so what I want to do is I want to right click on my file and go to Open With and choose GIMP. And this is just one of the many methods for opening photos into GIMP. So here we have our original photo. So the first step in my photo editing process is to crop and scale the image. So what I'll do is I'll come over here to the crop tool located in the toolbox, and I can just draw my crop here to whatever I want it to be. If you want it to be a certain aspect ratio, you can set that over here, or even a certain size, you could type that over here. I'm going to check the fixed aspect ratio option and type 1920:1280. So that's telling GIMP that I want this to be 1920 wide by 1280 tall in terms of the aspect ratio. The actual size of the crop is going to depend on how large or small I draw this. But you can see that as I drag this, it's maintaining that aspect ratio that we set there. So I'm just going to crop that right there, and I'm going to click inside of here. And now our image is cropped. And by the way, I did have my rule of thirds guide set here, and that's why you saw those lines. That just allows you to see, where your subject is within this rule of thirds principle that's found in photography. And I'm just going to grab another tool here and hit Control-Z because that did crop that right there. Alright, so once I've cropped my image, I want to go ahead and scale this image down. You can see up here at the top that my image is over 5,000 pixels by 3,000 pixels. That's a pretty large image, and if you did want to use this for something like printing it on a poster or just using this where you need a larger image, you can go ahead and keep this as large as you want. But I think when you're just editing general images in GIMP and maybe uploading them to social media or on your website, you do usually want to scale them down just because they're not only easier to work with, within GIMP, GIMP is going to work faster, but also it's going to take up less room wherever you're storing this. So if it's on a website, you don't want an extremely large photo to be stored on your website. It'll slow your website down. But anyway, to scale this, I'll go over to Image, Scale Image. And right here I could set my width and height, and you'll see I have a chain link icon right here and it's locked. That means this is going to maintain the original aspect ratio of the image, which just means the proportion of the width to the height. So I'll type in 1920 and hit the tab key, and that will automatically adjust my height to 1280. And then I do want to keep this resolution set pretty high to 300 just in case we want to print this. 72 pixels per inch is more so for web, so if you are using this photo for a website, go ahead and keep your X and Y resolution set to 72 pixels per inch. And I'll set my quality interpolation and no halo, and I'll hit scale. And that will scale our image down a bit. I'll hold Control and use my mouse wheel to zoom in, and that just gives us a better view of the image. So next what I like to do is use the Shadows Highlights tool, and I do have an entire tutorial dedicated to this tool on my YouTube channel. And so what I do to access this tool is go to Colors, Shadows Highlights, and this will bring up my Shadows Highlights dialog box. This is going to allow me to bring up the details in the shadows and also either bring up or tone down the details in the highlights while also shifting the white point. And shifting the white point is going to make our image basically either brighter or darker overall. Again, I have an entire tutorial that goes over the details of this tool, but what I'll do is I'll grab my shadow slider and I'm just going to slide this up a little bit, And you can see the darker pixels within the shadows of my image will start to brighten up a little bit, and that's just allowing us to recover some details. In this case, because a lot of the shadows are in the background of the image, I don't necessarily need to turn these up that much, really, if even at all. But then I can come over to my highlights, and you can see that as I drag my highlights up, you can start to see where the highlights are in the image, which is pretty much right here in the top right corner of the image. Some of it is on her hair, which is pretty nice because it does give her sort of like a natural hair light there. And by the way, this photo was taken in pretty much all natural lighting conditions and a little bit of artificial light from diffused light sources. I'm not going to get into light sources too much right now, but that's why this is a softer looking image. There's just a lot of natural and diffused light on here. So I can just adjust the highlights here, and I could check the preview box, and you can see there's a before, there's an after. So this is looking a little bit brighter. I actually don't need to make it that bright. And then the white point adjustment is basically going to make the entire image brighter, not just the shadows or the highlights. So you can see that's just shifting the white point a little bit, and it's causing there to be brighter and more white pixels in here. So there's a before and there's an after, so that looks pretty good to me, and I'll just go ahead and click OK. So for the third step in my color editing process, I like to use the color balance tool, and you can find that over here in Colors, Color Balance. So what the color balance tool allows you to do is adjust the colors in your shadows, midtones, and highlights of your image. This is super useful because oftentimes when you take a photo with your camera, either due to the lighting conditions or the camera itself or whatever other factor is going on with the colors, you know, maybe what the person is wearing at the time of the photo shoot, your photo is going to basically produce some colors that you don't necessarily want in an image, or it's going to produce maybe too much of one color, or maybe just the overall colors are off in the image. So usually you just need to tweak the colors a little bit in your image. If you took the image properly, which I think was the case for this photo shoot that we did, you don't usually have to make too drastic of changes with the color balance tool. So don't, try to really add a bunch of red in here, add a bunch of magenta, and you'll see what I mean by that in a second here. So let me go ahead and start editing this photo, and I'm starting with the midtones here. And so what this is doing is it's allowing me to add either red or cyan to the midtones in my image. And so red and cyan are basically opposites, so whenever you add one of one color, or whenever you add more of one color, I should say, that is going to basically take away from that other color. So here you could see we're taking away cyan and adding red, or if we go the other way, it's doing the opposite. And it's basically up to your eye as to whether or not you want to add more or less of a color. So it's kind of up to personal preference, and also, like I said, just the individual photo you took and the various colors going on in the photo. In this case, I personally like the midtones having a little bit of cyan in here, so I'll stick with that. And you can see I only added -2.5. Negative just means you're going to the left with the slider, positive means you're going to the right. And so now I'm just going to do the same here with each of the colors in the different ranges of my image. So green and magenta both do not look great, adding a bunch of that either way. I do think magenta looks a little bit better, so I'm going to go ahead and stick with that. And now I'm going to adjust my blues and yellows here. And so in this case, I think the blues do look a little bit better. So again, you can see I'm making very minute adjustments here. I even just added a tiny bit there, and that made a little bit more of a difference. So here is a before, here's an after, and this is just for the midtones. And we're going to come back here later with the color temperature tool, and we're going to adjust the color temperature. So if you think this looks a little bit too cool right now, don't worry, we are going to go back and we're going to edit this with another tool. So now we're going to move on to the shadows tool, and this will adjust the colors in the shadows of my image. So again, we're just going to use the eye test to see which looks better. That obviously looks way too artificial. You can see there's too much cyan showing up here in the shadows. And so let me see what this looks like with a little bit of red. And so in this case, it's actually the opposite. I think the red looks a little bit better in the shadows. And now I'm going to move down here to the green and magenta option. And so again, I think magenta actually looks a little bit better. And then we're going to move on to yellow and blue. This time I think adding a little bit of blue helps. And so here's a before, here's an after. Next I'll move on to the highlights range, and I'm going to do the same thing. Using the eye test, I'm going to adjust the colors here. and just determine from the eye test what looks better. So you'll notice that for the midtones and the shadows, I added more blue, but for the highlights, I'm going to go with a little bit more yellow. The reason for that is that the highlights are more of her hair and where the sun was coming in. Those are colors that I want to come off as yellow or almost like a golden color in the final image. So I am going to stick with yellow on those. I don't want to cool off the highlights because I think that just doesn't look right. So I am going to add a little bit of yellow to this. And here's a before, here's an after, and I'll click OK. And there is our photo after the color balance adjustment. So step 4 in this process is adjusting the levels of the image. And the reason I did the levels after the color balance, because I know some of you are going to contest the order of this, but the reason I'm doing the levels after the color balance is that if I do the levels first, and maybe I make a wrong adjustment to the levels and I turn up the highlights a bit too much, and then I try to edit the colors, some of the colors will end up looking a little bit too artificial in the final image. So for that reason, I'm using the levels tool after the color balance tool. So I'm going to come over to colors, levels, and that'll bring up the levels dialog box. So the purpose of the levels tool in this case is to adjust the brightness of the shadows, midtones, and highlights in our image. And that is as opposed to the color balance tool, which allows us to adjust the colors of those 3 ranges in our image. So in this case, I'm just adjusting like the brightness or the darkness. So by making these adjustments, we are actually affecting both the brightness and the contrast of the image. And so this is almost like a more advanced brightness contrast tool, which is another tool found in GIMP. I'm not going to go over that in today's tutorial. But let me go ahead and make adjustments to this to show you guys. So this arrow over here is going to adjust the shadows of my image, so this black arrow. So I'm just going to drag that right to where the histogram ends. If your guys' histogram goes all the way over to the left, you can just drag it in a little bit and just do it until it looks good on your image. But when I do that, you'll see that darkens my image overall, and that's not entirely what I want to do. So what I can do is I can drag my highlights over a little bit. So that is this white triangle over here, this white slider. So if I drag this up too much, it'll create overexposed parts of my image, and that's not what I want to do. So I'm going to drag this down a little bit until my image is a little bit brighter, but not too bright. So this is just using that eye test to find a happy medium. And then I'm going to grab my midtones, and this allows you to either brighten or darken the image through the midtones. So this can help you find a pretty good balance between the shadows and the highlights because we can bring out the midtones now. And I actually am going to turn my highlights down a little bit here. And so here's a before. So you can see the image isn't quite as bright and doesn't have as much contrast. It's a little bit flatter of an image. And then here's an after. A little bit brighter, a little bit more contrast. I do want to turn the brightness, the highlights down a little bit, and then maybe tweak the midtones here. It does take a little bit of playing around to get the settings right where you want them. So there's a before, there's an after. That looks pretty good, so I'll click OK. Alright, so now that we've improved the brightness and contrast of our image through the levels tool, next I'm going to start working a little bit more on the colors of our image. We've already done that with the color balance tool, but step 5 is to now use the saturation tool to help bring out some of the intensity of our colors in our image. So I can access this tool by going to Colors, Saturation. So whether you want to increase the intensity or decrease the intensity of the colors in your image is going to depend on the image itself. There are plenty of times where I decrease the saturation in an image, and when you make an image less saturated, you are taking away the intensity of the colors. And then there are other examples where I like to increase the intensity of the colors in the image, and so that is just going to add a bit more color to our image. So in this case, with this image, I'm actually going to just use my slider here to adjust the scale of this. So by turning the scale slider down, you are essentially desaturating your photo. You can see if I go all the way, it'll make this photo black and white. And if I go all the way up, it'll make this a very colorful image, way too colorful in my opinion. So what you want to do is just subtly add or remove color from an image. Usually more dramatic photos will require taking away some of the saturation. In this case, I think because she has, very blue eyes and very blonde hair, and all of that is kind of meshing very well, and there's also some colors going on in the background here, I'm going to actually increase the saturation a little bit. And you can see here's a before, this is the original image, here's after. So a lot more colorful here, and it's helping our colors stand out by making them a little bit more intense. And then I'll just click OK. For the sixth step, we're going to use really the last color tool for this tutorial, and that is going to be the color temperature tool. I like to use this tool at this point in the photo editing process because we now have our colors correct. We have, for the most part, our brightness and contrast corrected here in our image. So now I like to sort of add a little bit of tone to this image, maybe warm it up a little bit or cool it off a little bit based on the colors of the image that are already done. So now I'm going to come over here and go to Colors, Color Temperature. And so you have an original temperature and you have intended temperature. I like to just keep these settings at their default locations here at 6500, and then I'll just adjust the intended temperature. If I turn this value up, so if I drag the slider to the right and this is going to increase this number, it's going to make my image warmer overall, versus if I drag this to the left, it is going to decrease this value and make the image cooler overall. I think that this image looks a little bit better when it's warmer, just because there was a little bit of that diffused artificial light which had a little bit of a warmer tone to it. Even though there was a lot of natural light in here, I think that warmer light from the inside the building, the ambient light as they call it, really helped to make this image look a little bit warmer. And so when we add a little bit to that, it helps to enhance that effect. So here's a before and here's an after. You can see I just turned this up a little bit to around 7,000. I didn't go with an exact number here, but I'll just go ahead and click OK, and that will apply those changes. Step 7 is going to be using the Curves tool, and this tool, as I've said in many tutorials in the past, is going to help, if you use it correctly, add a little bit of contrast to the image. So I'm going to come over here to Colors, Curves, and that'll bring up my Curves dialog here. And I'm just going to click on the middle of this line here, and this is going to be our curve. And you can see there's a little histogram here. If we go to the left of the curve, that is going to be the shadows of our image, and then the right is going to be the highlights. So if I come over here and click and create a point on this curve, and then I drag it down, you can see now why it's called a curve. That is going to darken our shadows here. And then if I come over here and I click and create a point on the right side of my curve and drag it up, that will brighten up our highlights, and that is going to help us create a little bit more contrast. We have already adjusted the contrast a little bit using the Levels tool. The Curves tool just allows us to give the image a little bit more contrast, help those details stand out just a tiny bit more, and really just give our photo a little bit more of an edge. So here we're creating an S-curve, and S-curves create contrast, but if I adjust the shadows down a little bit and do the same with the highlights, that is going to tone down our contrast. I don't want to overdo the contrast because it does look a little bit artificial when we do that. So there's a before, there's an after. You can see it just looks a tiny bit better. So I'll click OK. That brings us to step 8, which is using the airbrush and heal tools to improve the complexion of our models. So this is obviously a step that is only going to be useful when you have a model in your photo. And in my case, for this photo, I'm going to hold Control and use the mouse wheel to zoom in. I have a pretty close-up shot of the model's face here. So I do want to improve the complexion, even though she does have a really good complexion. So I'm going to come over here and grab my airbrush tool. And you can see my settings over here. I have the opacity set to around 50%. That's just going to ensure that this doesn't get painted on too strongly. And then I have the hardness set pretty low, and I have the rate set pretty low. The hardness is going to make this brush a little bit soft, which means the edges of this are going to be fuzzier, and therefore it's going to be harder to see, where the lines end where I'm painting. So it just helps it sort of blend in with the skin around the model's complexion. And the rate is just going to ensure that the color doesn't come out of the airbrush tool too fast. Again, trying to avoid making this look a little bit too artificial. If I hold the Control key and click on my image, that's going to bring up my eyedropper tool. I can click and drag this around, and you'll see my foreground color will change based on where I'm clicking with the eyedropper tool. I can also just click once and that'll grab whatever color I clicked on. So this part is useful when you're trying to grab a skin tone. And what you want to do is grab the skin tone of the area you're painting on. So I'll grab, for starters, this skin tone here, which is this sort of like rouge blush color. And you'll see that that is now my color over here. And then I can paint with this brush, and you'll see this isn't being applied on too thick or too strong or anything. It's just pretty soft, and that is the benefit of using the airbrush tool. It does come out pretty soft. I'll hold Control again and grab a different color here and just paint a little bit along her cheek right here. You always want to paint along the contours of the face, because otherwise it'll make her face look too angular and therefore too artificial. And then I'm going to hold Control and grab this color down here. And you can see I'm just painting out. And right here, I did paint a little bit too much, and you can see now there's too hard of a line between, the two colors of her face here. So let me just hit Control Z and undo that. And I'll hold Control and just paint right here. And you don't have to paint everywhere on her face. You could just paint the areas where you want to improve the complexion a little bit. Hold Control. And you can also increase or decrease the size of your brush using the brackets on your keyboard. So let me actually hit Control Z. I didn't want to paint that part out. And then you can see if there's any other parts of her skin where you want to paint. I'm going to increase the size of my brush again and just paint a little bit up here. Again, the whole point of this is just to make her complexion look a little bit smoother. I'll hold Control and I'll just paint a little bit right here. And I'll decrease my brush size because I don't want to paint. There's a pretty big difference between these two colors, so I don't want to paint the color I have selected now up here. It's going to change the shape of her nose. And for her face in particular, I don't want to paint too much because she does have some natural freckles and I don't want to paint over those. So I think that looks pretty good there. You can also zoom in a little bit and use the heal tool if you have something like acne, which in this case we don't really have. But I can grab my heal tool here from my toolbox and use the bracket keys on my keyboard. And let's say, for instance, I wanted to get rid of this spot right here, which I'm pretty sure is just like a freckle or something. But now you can see that that's gone ahead and erased that spot there using the heal tool. Or maybe I want to get rid of like this hair here. I can hold Control, click to grab a source, and then I can just paint away this hair that's sort of overlapping some of her face. And now that hair is gone. So hold Control and zoom out a bit. Now that I've finished adjusting the colors, adjusting the lighting in my image, and touching up the model a little bit, the next step is I'm going to sharpen this image up a bit. That is going to help bring out some of the detail and make this image look a little bit more high quality. This was taken on a pretty good camera, a Canon 7D, so the photo should have a pretty decent overall quality, and I do want to really bring that out in the final image. So what I'll do is I'll come over here to Filters, and I'll go to Enhance, and then Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. And this feature is going to sharpen up our image. And I don't want to crank the radius too much because, as you can see, this is going to make our image look terrible. So by default, it comes with 3 and 5. If you're not sure, you don't have an eye for sharpening your photo, just go with the 3 and 5 default settings because those usually look fine. But you can adjust the radius and the amount here. And I'm just going to make this a little bit more than 3. And then the amount, you can see if I turn this all the way down, it barely does anything. It's basically not sharpening this at all. And if I turn it up, it's sharpening it way too much. So I do like to keep this around that 0.5 default setting there. I probably could have been fine with just keeping this at the default, but I'll click OK. Step 10 in this photo editing process, which is the final step, is to add a vignette to the photo. And vignettes are going to help frame what's going on in your photo. So in this case, we want to frame the model. We want to draw the person's eye, whoever's looking at this, to the model. And we also want to kind of take away, for example, in the top right corner here, this is a little bit overexposed, and it's kind of upsetting the balance of the photo here. So the vignette is going to help dim some of these lights down here and just help frame this photo and also help draw the eye inward into the subject's face. So when I create a vignette, I like to create a new layer, and I've already got this named vignette. I'm going to have the fill width set to transparency, and make sure you also have the mode here set to normal, and I'll click OK. Next, I'm going to go to Filters, Light and Shadow, Vignette. And this is going to draw a vignette for us pretty much automatically. We do have to make some adjustments here to the vignette. So in this case, I want to adjust the radius, which is going to adjust really how far out or how far in this vignette goes on our image. So it's really the radius of this ellipse going on right here inside the vignette or in the middle of the vignette. So you'll see if I decrease the radius, it's going to decrease the size of this ellipse here. Or if I increase it, it's going to increase the size of it and therefore push that vignette outward. So I like to have it so that the vignette is just showing up in the corners of our image here. I don't like having it being too prominent, so I do turn the radius up a tiny bit. The softness is going to determine how much the vignette spills towards the middle of our image. So if I turn that softness down, you'll see it's going to retreat a little bit there. And the gamma is a pretty similar function there. You can see that as I increase the gamma, it's going to basically cause the black that's in the middle of our image to retreat a little bit. So I don't really like that look too much, so I'm going to turn the gamma down a little bit. And then you've also got proportion, which is going to determine the shape of our ellipse here relative to the proportion of the image. So right now this is the exact same proportion of the image, which is what I want to keep. Squeeze is just going to make this, either narrower or less narrow. So that is also going to adjust the proportion of the ellipse. And then the center is just going to be where the center of this ellipse is inside the vignette. So in this case, I do want to make this a little bit off center because our model is a little bit to the right in our image. So I'm going to just drag the center X slider to the right a little bit. And let me also just reduce the squeeze here. You can also rotate your vignette if you want. I'm not going to do that for this image because I don't think it makes sense. But here's a before, here's an after. Obviously this vignette is still too prominent and we're going to adjust that in a second. But I'll just click OK. And then I'll click on the vignette layer and I'm just going to adjust the opacity here. And this is just allowing this vignette to be a little bit less prominent. If you think that the vignette lines are too noticeable, like in this case, you could see that there's a vignette right here, you can go to Filters, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and then you can adjust the blur here and you can see that that is softening up that line created by that vignette. And I'll click OK. And this is why I like to have vignettes on their own layers because it gives you a little bit more flexibility with the vignette. So here's the original photo we started with. So obviously it's a lot flatter of an image, a lot less colors going on. And here is the final image. So that's it for my easy 10-step process to editing photos in GIMP. If I left anything out that you guys often used in your photo editing, feel free to let me know in the comments. Otherwise, if you like this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/daviesmediadesign. You can visit my website at daviesmediadesign.com. You can enroll in my best-selling GIMP photo editing course from beginner to pro photo retoucher on Udemy. And you can support our channel and help us grow by becoming a patron on Patreon. And I'll include a link to that as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. So thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.